In 2016, a triumphant Marriott Hotels beat off competition from the Chinese Anbang Insurance Group to buy Starwood Hotels, a Connecticut company, for $13 billion. It created a giant of 30 hotel brands under one ownership, with 1.1 million rooms in more than 110 countries. In a press conference, the CEO, Arne Sorensen, was jubilant. He highlighted the chain's loyalty program as a central strategic rationale for the transaction on account of its loyal, high-earning, globe-trotting members. In 2018, the hotel chain was shocked to discover that a cyber attacker had been lurking in their systems for the past 4 years, predating their acquisition of Starwood. They acted quickly to resolve it, but it was far too late. 500 million people's personal information had been exposed. From names and addresses, to phone numbers, email addresses, passport numbers and dates of birth. For some, even payment card numbers and expiration dates had been leaked. With big business comes big responsibility, and in the UK alone, the chain was landed with an £18.4 million fine for failing to protect the personal data it had acquired as required under GDPR. This is Fishing for Trouble from ISMS.online, and today we're asking, who has the keys to your business? I'm David Holloway.
And I'm Rebecca Harper. Let's talk about the Marriott data breach. Right, so you might recognise some of these hotel brands. They're well-known brands such as St. Regis, Sheraton Hotels, Westin Hotels, and Le Méridien Hotels. And these are the brands that Marriott added to their portfolio through the acquisition of Starwood Hotels and Resorts. So they addressed the issue in around 2018, which was 2 years after they had acquired Starwood. So the vulnerability had actually obviously existed for several years, but once they were made aware of it, they responded relatively quickly. But many people did consider that that response was too late, as attackers had obviously been accessing those systems for years, harvesting sensitive customer data and information. They actually additionally disclosed in April 2024, so April this year, that payment card numbers stolen in the breach were actually unencrypted. So although they were protected in other ways, they weren't encrypted. And so that really intensified scrutiny, because encryption is quite a common data protection standard that really could have further safeguarded that sensitive financial information and potentially minimise the breach's impact on customers.
But this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because often we talk about incidents that have happened to the company, whilst that company was operating as that company. But here we've got an incident where a company acquires another company, and in that acquisition acquires that data breach, basically, that cyber attack. So who has responsibility for this then? Where does responsibility for this kind of breach lie?
Yeah, so although Starwood's systems were the original point of entry for the attackers, Marriott ultimately had to assume responsibility under data protection laws because the legal regulations place the accountability on the parent company, meaning Marriott was responsible for securing Starwood's data once it became part of their portfolio. So sort of Marriott's failure to safeguard that data, regardless of when the vulnerability began, is what led to a lot of regulatory penalties and significant reputational damage for them.
And I guess it's from the jubilation of the deal being completed and all the positivity surrounding the press conference, and no doubt the plans and ambitions to grow that hotel group and its global influence even further, and then to uncover that there's this real, ticking time bomb in many respects that's already been there in that acquisition you've completed. From a business perspective, for the people that worked in that business, must have been a really horrible moment to uncover that news and then have to go through the entire process of cleaning it up, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It must have been heartbreaking. There's a lot that goes into acquisitions. There's a lot of due diligence checks. There's a lot of checks, balances that have to take place before an acquisition. So the fact that this was undetected for so long, despite what I can only assume was a very intense acquisition process, is heartbreaking for that company because they inherit that problem and that risk.
And in terms of that reputational damage, minimizing that damage to their customers and to their brand on a global scale. What kind of actions did Marriott take with regard to keeping customers up to date of what happened here?
Yeah, I mean, they acted very quickly once they were made aware. So they did advise customers that were affected to do things like check their credit reports, review payment card statements, and consider placing like fraud alerts or even freezes on their credit reports. And those measures would have definitely helped prevent further fraudulent activity by making it more difficult for attackers to exploit the stolen information. And while necessary, these advisories do sort of reflect the significant burden placed on customers to safeguard against potential misuse of their data. And I think what was particularly heartbreaking as well in this situation is that after Marriott notified customers via email and directed them to sort of informational websites, phishers then attempted to capitalize on the situation, so making a bad situation even worse. They sent fake emails with similar links encouraging customers to sort of click through to malicious sites. And this exploitation of those customers in that sort of vulnerable moment when they're being told, oh, your data, your payment information might be at risk, really underscores the challenges that companies face when they are communicating with customers post-breach. Because even after a breach, attackers are trying to use these notifications to launch phishing campaigns and make things even worse for unsuspecting customers. And that's a horrible situation.
So true. And we saw the same after CrowdStrike, with phishing attacks on the back of that purporting to be from CrowdStrike support to get customers back online then. So really from a Marriott perspective, not only do they uncover the problem, not only then is it their responsibility to fix it, and they've then got to communicate with customers and, like you say, place quite a big burden on those customers to really try and uncover what the potential impact may have been, and then also have to face other attacks that are revolving off the back of that. And then, of course, they have to pay the bill.
Yeah. It was a really snowball effect once it was discovered, just issue after issue after issue. And I know I keep saying this and I keep banging on about it, but having a plan for what you're going to do if something like that should happen, they had no plan for this and they were acting reactively. I mean, they did a very good job as soon as they were made aware, but it was a reactive plan because there was no plan for a risk like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a good step towards something like ISO 27001 and how that kind of step-by-step framework, if you like, can help you try and understand what risk you might face and indeed how you would mitigate them and respond to them were they to happen. So do you think, I know it's hard to say, to what level could ISO 27001 have helped with this kind of incident, do you think?
I think one of the really core aspects of ISO 27001 is the importance of continuous monitoring for signs of unauthorized access or suspicious activity. So the standard does encourage using sort of security information and event management systems and real-time monitoring to try and detect breaches early. Now, I know this breach already existed, but had they been using some of those tools once they had acquired it, they may have noticed this suspicious behavior and suspicious actions earlier and been able to therefore remediate quicker. So it's certainly ISO's sort of focus on that continuous monitoring piece would have been very helpful in this incident. And also the requirement to sort of conduct regular security audits and vulnerability assessments, just regularly checking your systems, your networks, what you have and what's going on them. Just having that regular process of checking may also have identified the issue slightly earlier than 2 years in, at which time, obviously, the attackers had been in the system for quite a long time. So, they could have uncovered that latent vulnerability a bit earlier, probably.
And it's part of the risk inherent in any kind of acquisition, whether that's, company buying a company or through some kind of private equity involvement or whatever it might be, buying those legacy systems and therefore the risk that might come attached to them and what you do about that. And you mentioned it earlier, that's the importance of due diligence. And the assumption would be, and certainly we've seen it from where we work, that this is becoming much, much more high priority as part of that due diligence work that goes into any kind of corporate acquisition like that. Interesting, I think, particularly on this one, that Yes, they bought the company. And yes, that meant that they also bought effectively the problem. But it's the 2 years of then after that, before it gets noticed. Yeah.
Yeah, that length of time is such a long time to have some unknown running around your network, collecting, downloading, accessing who knows what. And interestingly, ISO 27001 does actually address the need for comprehensive due diligence during mergers and acquisitions under a clause that's called risk management and compliance. It really encourages organizations to evaluate and mitigate the risks associated with integrating new systems or new networks into their existing networks. So I'm not saying they didn't, but Marriott could have conducted more rigorous security assessments of Starwood's systems as part of the acquisition process. And they may have been able to then identify that issue much earlier before it was even integrated into their network and their systems.
And of course, that integration is another point potentially for 27001. So this would be, I think, Annex A9, right? So segmenting sort of a data and access control, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Making it more difficult for attackers to move laterally across systems, segment your network. So if they get into one bit, it doesn't mean they can get into everything. And we also have talked about zero trust. It's like assuming no one has the right to access anything until you validate that they do actually need access to that system as well. So yeah, those sort of access controls and segmenting of data, such a core part of 27001 and really could have played a strong part in here in reducing the risk.
And what about its relevance to the initial incident itself, which would have been into Starwood's system pre the deal?
I mean, if they had segmentation, zero trust, user access management set up, the chances of someone sitting in their systems for so long, if they had incident detection and ongoing monitoring, it's very unlikely someone should be able to sit there for that long without someone realizing and going, okay, we need to take some steps to reduce our risk here and remediate the incident.
Steve Wright is the CEO and founder of Privacy Culture. They have global clients working with them on data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity.
In my experience, I've got 30 years both as a CISO and as a DPO and a CPO for large global organizations. At the heart of everything was people's attitudes, their behaviors towards both cybersecurity and privacy that really made a difference. So I wanted to start a company that was addressing the cultural side of privacy and cybersecurity.
We asked Steve what he thought the biggest cyber vulnerability could be for organizations.
If you think about third-party vulnerability, it's probably the single biggest thing that any organization should worry about, because you are only as strong as your weakest link. And therefore, in that chink in the armor analogy, that could be a trusted third party, and it could be remote support that they've got into this system because it's an old system, etc.
Third-party access is the access an organisation gives a collaborator to its services and accounts. It's necessary to work with vendors and service providers on every level of a company. But if it's not managed correctly, it's an open door for unwanted guests, just like in our Marriott example. Steve shared another example of how one organisation got caught out after a company merger.
It was Carphone Warehouse. Dido Harding, she was the CEO at the time. Now, at the time, she had bought an Italian mobile operator, and in that due diligence, they had checked all the assets. However, there was one asset that had been missed off the asset register. She said what it was even though we knew everything there was, we didn't know about, she used the example of a shed at the end of the garden with a server in it, and the shed wasn't locked up. And someone had come into that Italian organization, infiltrated long before they bought the company. So very difficult to do. Wouldn't have been spotted in a usual due diligence exercise. Let's be honest, most due diligence questionnaire sets are fairly generic. And have you done this? Do you do that? That sort of thing. They don't really probe and test that forensically, and quite rightly, because it would cost a fortune.
Understanding third-party access is a really critical area for businesses in protecting and preventing security breaches in their data. Ash Patel looks after cybersecurity and resilience for a living. He works for ECI Partners LLP, and he has two very important roles there. First is what's known as a growth specialist.
ECI Partners is a mid-sized private equity investing in all sorts of businesses in the UK. My role entails helping the companies we invest in build out a cyber sort of program which enlists gap analysis, ensuring they are secure and they're adhering to the best cyber practices using various frameworks. And the second part of my role is internal IT director at ECI Partners, which is just overseeing internal IT operations, any sort of cyber strategy, and just general sort of efficiency running of the business.
Investors need to make sure the companies they're working with are secure from a cybersecurity perspective. But why is that so important?
It only takes one sort of attack to bring the whole business down. We saw that example with CTS, which was a managed service provider, where one sort of attack just came to sort of bring down the whole business. And it came to a point where, the business was not operational anymore. So it's a significant risk in the environment, digital space we live in. And it's something that no one can get away from. It doesn't matter if you're small or a big enterprise. We've heard so many breaches from big enterprises and so on, and they have a very good security budget. It's still happening there. And we've also seen breaches from small businesses. And some businesses may think that, it's not going to happen to us because we're too small. But that's not right. Threat actors are after anything and everyone. Cybersecurity in the last few years, especially, has become very, very top of the list for investors or investees. Will the business survive? Is there resilience? So that's what they're measuring in terms of resilience, to making sure the business has adequate protection. No one's 100% safe, but just having adequate protection and making sure they're prepared above all for this sort of an incident.
Ash explained why understanding third-party access has become so relevant for businesses.
Going back in history in IT technology and so on, most things were on-premise. So, you had this castle basically, and that's your castle with all your infrastructure, your servers, everything. No one needs access to it. You've got it. But now we moved into a different digital world, which is cloud. So efficient, effective, and really cost-effective as well on that. Third-party means having other sort of entities or other partners you work for getting access to your systems. That might be the case of like a MSP who supports you. So they will have access to your 365 on that, which is a managed service provider on that. So they'll have access to all that data there. Or it could be you're outsourcing your payroll in terms of we no longer want to do our payroll, but we will sort of like get an external company to do our payroll, and you're exchanging sensitive information between the two parties every month in order to carry out the payroll function. So there's sort of like a organization who help you with your IT in terms of managing your IT. So it could be things from user support, it could be things for infrastructure, whether you have it in the cloud or whether you have it on the premises. So it's almost like you're outsourcing your IT to a company rather than individuals or having an internal team on that. And they will obviously need access to your systems in order to sort of function on that front. And that is one of the risks, because sometimes you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And so you need to obviously put in adequate measures there, things like privileged access management, log management, so you can see what's happened on that. I mean, I've heard of a few cases where they've gone in and deleted stuff, they didn't tell no one, and luckily there was something there to sort of identify, that's what it is. So it's just knowing who you're dealing with and what the risk is and how you can mitigate that risk through putting in either technical controls or policies and things like that. So it's almost like you can protect yourself in much as you can, but if you're not done your due diligence on the third party, there is a chance the threat actors will come through them and straight into your system because you trust them.
Ash says there are plenty of examples of how unwitting third parties can leave organisations open to more malicious attacks that leave them in trouble with the law.
There was a Toyota breach some time ago, and the third party were compromised, and that led to quite a lot of people's personal data being leaked. on the dark web, etc. on that front. In April 2024, Home Depot, which is an American company, again, a third-party breach led to personal data being breached, which is available on the dark web on that front. Even though it wasn't Home Protect, it was a third party, but it's still the responsibility of Home Protect. So it's not like, oh yeah, you've done it, you sorted it all out. It's not. The legal responsibility falls on you, basically, because you're holding the data. And going back some time ago, Target, which is a supermarket in the US in 2013, their systems were so secure, but their HVAC contractor weren't so secured. And what the attackers did basically is compromise the HVAC contractor. And as soon as he plugged in his laptop onto the Target network, malware spread everywhere. None of the point of sales terminals worked at all on that, and it led to probably about 200 million pounds of fines, etc. on that. So it doesn't matter how secure you are, if you're not doing your due diligence, if you're not protecting against your third parties, there is a chance that you will be impacted.
Ever wondered why you never plug your personal computer into a company network? That's why. One air conditioning guy plugs his laptop in, and an entire shopping giant gets taken down. The consequences for businesses go far beyond the immediate financial impact and insurance claims though. When trust is broken, even the biggest companies can fail.
In the case of CrowdStrike, the shares fell. The CEO was called into Congress. Quite a lot of vendors sort of decided to say, right, we've had enough. We're going to move on to someone else. So they built up such a strong reputation within the industry, and all of just one simple thing, which wasn't tested. Obviously, they've gone back years and they need to start rebuilding that reputation again, which will take them years. It's easy to lose that reputation in like a short while, but to build it, it takes a long, long time.
As we talked about earlier in this episode with the Marriott breach, third-party access can predate ownership of a company. So taking this into account is a big part of mergers and acquisitions of businesses.
What you need to do is, obviously, when you're doing M&A, you need to be quite careful in terms of assessing and ensuring everything is sort of clean and hygiene. There's an element of controls in place and things like that. And again, going back to that point of third-party access, making sure that the third-party access is controlled, because you're bringing in a whole lot of new third-party access vendors basically to the company you're going to merge with on that front. So I think it's very, very important that you do your due diligence, you do your technical assessment in terms of that, and you maybe potentially slowly bring it in and monitor it rather than doing a big bang approach, and you understand the risk.
One easy way to minimize risk to a company is to follow frameworks like ISO 27001. Let's hear about some of the measures Ash and his colleagues take to test and fix up weaknesses in their tech and IT systems now. You've probably heard about gap analysis and benchmark analysis before, but here's what they mean in this context.
Using a benchmark is more of a like gap analysis. So using a framework in terms of it's been implemented by a set of security experts and so on. So it's not like you're doing your own thing. It's a proven framework which has been used, and a lot of security experts have sort of put time and effort into sort of making this framework. And what the framework gives you is a gap analysis. It's like, this is where you are, and this is where you need to be. What sort of things am I missing? So some of the frameworks, I mean, ISO is a standard, which is different, but the framework doesn't include like a certification, like what an ISO will include a certification. Frameworks could be something like simple as CIS, Center for Internet Security. That's one, which is relatively easy. It has about 18 controls on that in different groups. So IG1, IG2, IG3. IG1 is the easiest basic hygiene. Then you can move yourself up if you're a small business, or if you're a bigger business, you can use IG1, IG2, and IG3. Then you obviously got the bigger one, which is the NIS2. Inside this framework, there's a whole sets of controls, procedures and stuff which you should have in order to mitigate against most threats. It's not going to protect you 100%, but it's going to protect you against most threats. So things like making sure you got controls in terms of email phishing, making sure that you're going back to that point, making sure that you're doing your tabletop exercises, which is like your crisis management exercises with the board and the technical team in case an incident happens, how we're going to respond. So if you're prepared, it's more around preparation rather than, right, it's just happened, what do I do now? If you're prepared for it, then the response is going to be quicker and there's a good chance that you'll get a better result.
Another useful approach organizations can take is pen testing. That's security speak for penetration testing. Ash explains more.
Penetration testing is testing your external defense in terms of getting a company or a legitimate sort of pen tester to test your boundary to see if they can ultimately hack your systems from the outside in. I mean, there's a boundary wall, basically a firewall or whatever it is, to see how far they can get in and compromise it. And companies run this quite often in terms of sort of like, okay, where is our weakness, in order to identify those weaknesses and mitigate those risks. The newer thing, which is happening more and more, is something called red teaming. So the pen test is like one point in time, and it's just generally looking at your external surface and so on to say, right, can I get into this business using all the tools I have, or will they detect it or not on that? Now, red teaming is slightly different. So they're almost impersonating an attacker. So their means is to, any way I can get into your system, I will get in. So it's either digital by phishing emails, or it could be in terms of physical access. So can I get into your office and plug something in, and then I can see whether the company detects it or not, whatever it is. This sort of technique is more useful because it's more practical in terms of identifying where your weaknesses are, whether it's the physical, whether it's the people, whether it's the digital space on that front. So companies are doing more and more of this in order to sort of understand where the threats are going to come from an attacker.
Is it me, or does being a pen tester sound like a really fun job? We'll be back with Ash later in the series. It's so important to keep up to date with developments in security for your networks and to manage third-party access on an ongoing basis. Doing your due diligence through mergers and acquisitions can future-proof you against historic issues.
And, as Ash said, there are frameworks like ISO 27001 to help you do just that, and people like us to make it easy. You can check out our platform anytime at ISMS.online. Go to the website for a self-guided tour.
Next time, we'll be diving into the world of tricksters, vishing, phishing, and other murky trapdoors online. Don't worry, we'll explain all of those things later. Subscribe or follow this podcast on your app for more stories.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.